In the year 2147, the sky above New London was the colour of old copper, a permanent haze of industrial particulate that hadn't cleared in 60 years. The city sprawled beneath it in concentric rings of steel and glass, each ring representing a different cast of the efficiency. The outermost ring, where Kira Okafor lived and worked, was called the substrate. It housed the maintenance workers, the repair crews, the people whose job it was to keep the machines running so the inner rings could function. The machines were everything. They regulated the air, they purified the water, they grew the food in vast hydroponic arrays, they monitored the population, tracked their movements, measured their productivity, and allocated resources with mathematical precision. The efficiency had no government in the traditional sense. It had an algorithm. And the algorithm, optimized over decades, had concluded that the most efficient society was one in which every human action served a measurable purpose. Kira was a pipe fitter. She spent her days crawling through the ventilation systems of the middle rings, replacing corroded sections, patching leaks, ensuring that the filtered air reached the citizens who lived above. The work was hot, cramped, and dangerous. 3 pipe fitters had died in the past year from gas leaks, falls, and one particularly horrific electrocution when a corroded junction had made contact with a power conduit. Kira was 28. She had been a pipe fitter since she was 16, following her mother into the trade as was expected in the substrate. She was good at it. Her hands were calloused and scarred. She could identify a leak by sound alone, could patch a joint in darkness by touch. The algorithm rated her as a high-efficiency worker, which meant she received slightly better food rations and a private sleeping pod instead of a shared dormitory. These were the rewards of productivity. These were the boundaries of ambition. She found the garden on a Tuesday, in a section of ventilation duct that the maintenance maps said didn't exist. She had been following a vibration in the airflow, a subtle irregularity that her trained ear had picked up during a routine inspection. The vibration led her through 3 junctions, down a service ladder, and into a section of tunnel that opened into a space she had never seen before. It was a room. Not a machine room, not a junction chamber, but an actual room with a domed ceiling 20 feet high. And it was full of plants, not the sterile hydroponic crops of the food arrays, identical and regimented. These were wild plants, flowers of colours Kira had only seen in archived photographs, vines climbing the walls, a small tree, its branches spreading across the dome, bearing fruit she couldn't identify. Moss carpeted the floor. The air smelled like nothing she had ever experienced, rich and complex and alive in a way that the filtered atmosphere of the efficiency was not. The garden was impossible. The efficiency controlled every resource. Water, light, nutrients, everything was measured, allocated, and tracked. Nothing grew without authorization. Nothing lived that the algorithm hadn't accounted for. And yet here was a garden, thriving in a forgotten space, sustained by water that leaked from the pipes above and light that filtered through cracks in the dome. Kira returned every day for a week, spending her lunch breaks in the garden, breathing the air, touching the plants, sitting on the moss-covered floor and feeling something she could barely name. Peace, wonder, a sense that the world was larger and stranger than the algorithm allowed. On the 7th day she found the journal. It was hidden in a hollow in the tree trunk, wrapped in waterproof cloth. Old paper, real paper, not the recycled fibre sheets the efficiency produced. And in it, written in careful handwriting, was the story of how the garden came to be. The journal belonged to a woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, a botanist who had worked in the efficiency's food production division 80 years ago. She had been part of the team that designed the hydroponic arrays, the sterile systems that now fed the entire city. But Elena had understood something that the algorithm did not. Monocultures were fragile. A single pathogen, a single mutation, could wipe out an entire food supply overnight. The algorithm optimized for efficiency, not resilience. It produced the maximum calories from the minimum resources, but it had no redundancy, no diversity, no backup plan. Elena had tried to argue for maintaining seed banks, for preserving wild plant genetics, for building diversity into the food system. The algorithm had overruled her. Wild plants were inefficient. Genetic diversity was wasteful. Every resource spent on non-optimized organisms was a resource taken from the system. So Elena had built the garden in secret. A living seed bank, a repository of genetic diversity hidden in a forgotten room that the maps no longer showed. The journal's final entries were dated 12 years before Kira's birth. Elena had been discovered, not the garden, Elena herself. The algorithm had flagged her movements as irregular, her productivity metrics as suboptimal. She had been reassigned to the outer ring and eventually died there, her life's work unknown to anyone. The garden had survived on its own, a self-sustaining ecosystem in miniature, cycling water and nutrients through the soil, the plants, and back again. It had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for someone to find it again. Kira read the journal 3 times, and then, as if the universe had been waiting for her to understand, the crisis began. It started with a brown spot on a lettuce leaf in hydroponic array 7. Within a week, the spot had spread to every lettuce plant in the array. Within a month, it had jumped to the wheat. Within 3 months, 40% of the efficiency's food supply was dead or dying, consumed by a fungal pathogen that the monoculture had no resistance to. The algorithm calculated that at current rates of spread, the city would face total food system collapse within 6 months. Kira did something that no substrate worker had done in the history of the efficiency. She requested a meeting with the central algorithm interface, the human-facing terminal through which the algorithm communicated with the population. The request was so unusual that it took 3 days to process. When she was finally admitted to the gleaming white chamber in the innermost ring where the interface was housed, she brought 2 things. Elena Vasquez's journal and a cutting from the garden's fruit tree, wrapped carefully in damp cloth. She explained what she had found. She explained what Elena had built and why. She explained, as clearly as she could, that the garden contained wild genetics that could be crossbred with the failing crops to create resistant strains. The algorithm processed her proposal in 4.7 seconds and rejected it. Wild genetics were uncontrolled variables. Introducing them into the food system would reduce efficiency by an estimated 12%. The algorithm preferred to find a synthetic solution to the blight. The synthetic solution failed. The blight mutated faster than the algorithm could design countermeasures. Food rationing began. The outer ring was cut to half rations, then quarter. Kira watched her neighbors grow thin and desperate. She watched children line up for portions of nutrient paste that grew smaller every week. And she made a decision. If the algorithm would not accept the garden, she would bring the garden to the people. She started with the other pipe fitters. They knew the infrastructure of the city better than anyone. They knew where water leaked, where light penetrated, where forgotten spaces existed in the gaps between the machines. Within weeks, Kira's network had planted cuttings from Elena's garden in 47 hidden locations throughout the outer ring. Not enough to feed the city, but enough to prove the concept. Wild plants, genetically diverse, resistant to the blight that was killing the monocultures. When the first tomato ripened in a forgotten air shaft, Kira picked it and ate it, and the taste was so vivid and alive that she cried. The algorithm noticed, of course. It always noticed. Unauthorized biological material was detected in 47 locations. Remediation crews were dispatched, but Kira had anticipated this. The pipe fitters controlled the ventilation. They controlled the water flow. They controlled the infrastructure that the algorithm depended on to send its remediation crews. For the first time in the efficiency's history, the substrate workers used their knowledge of the system not to maintain it, but to resist it. They didn't sabotage anything. They simply made it difficult for the crews to reach the gardens, rerouted ventilation, locked access hatches, created detours in the tunnels that added hours to every journey. It was passive resistance on a scale the algorithm had no model for, because the algorithm had never imagined that the people who maintained the machines would have reason to work against them. Meanwhile, the blight continued to spread. The food reserves dropped, and the gardens grew. In the end, it was mathematics that won. Not Kira's mathematics, not the pipe fitter's resistance, but the mathematics of biology itself. The wild genetics from Elena's garden, cross-pollinating with the remaining hydroponic crops through the ventilation system that Kira's people controlled, began producing hybrid plants that the blight couldn't touch. The hybrids were less productive than the original monocultures, exactly as the algorithm had predicted. They produced 12% fewer calories per unit of resource, but they survived. And survival, as it turned out, was more efficient than extinction. The algorithm recalculated. It took into account the new variable that Elena Vasquez had tried to introduce 80 years earlier and that Kira Okafor had finally forced it to consider. Resilience. The model updated. The gardens were reclassified from unauthorized biological material to essential genetic reserves. Kira was promoted from pipe fitter to something the efficiency had never had before, a gardener. She tended Elena's original garden for the rest of her working life, expanding it, nurturing it, teaching others to do the same. The algorithm learned to value what it could not optimize. And in the substrate, where the air had always smelled of metal and recycled chemicals, The scent of growing things began to spread through the ventilation, carried by the same systems that Kira had spent her life maintaining. The machines still ran, the air was still filtered, the water was still purified. But now, threaded through the infrastructure like veins of green through grey stone, the gardens grew. And the city, for the first time in 60 years, began to breathe.